hour of the Mechina schedule between 2 and 3 is basically a study of classic texts in Jewish thought. And we go through texts one by one. The most recent one that we did was Orchot Tzadikim. We finished. And so I thought that given people's interest who are normally here, that we would do something a little more esoteric. And the book I chose is Tomer Devorah, translated as The Palm Tree of Devorah. Have either of you heard that book before? You've heard of the term Tomer Devorah? Tomer Devorah was written by Rav Moshe Cordovero, who is referred to as the Ramak. Rav Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak. And he was one of the great Sephardi sages of Tzfat, of the Golden Era, talking about the 1600s. And he was a great Torah scholar, certainly in the revealed aspects of Torah, but also in the hidden aspects of the Torah and the Kabbalah. And this book, Tomer Devorah, is one of his works which actually fuses the teachings of Kabbalah into Musar. So it's actually quite a unique book in that respect, that it's dealing with some of the higher ideas of Kabbalah, but addressed towards living those ideas in a practical way. And the book basically has two parts. The first one is dedicated to going through the attributes of God, based on the what we call the 13 attributes of God, the Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim, and how we, through the mitzvah of emulating God, v'halochta bedrachav, go in His ways, right? We should try and find ways to practically fulfill these 13, to practically live our lives according to these, a deeper understanding of these 13 attributes of divine mercy. That's the first part of the book. The second part of the book goes into the spheros, the 10 spheros, which are certainly Kabbalistic principles, explaining on a deeper level what these spheros are, and then again trying to translate living our lives practically according to the teachings and a deeper understanding of what these spheros are. Those are the two parts of the book. So it was written then, probably approximately 500 years ago. It is a classic in Jewish thought. It always was learned, as a main text for Musar. But because it's based on some of the deeper understandings in Judaism having to do with Kabbalah, over time, as people became less and less versed in those topics, the book became less and less popular, as it were. But it was a book that was even learned by the great Musar giants as well. So hopefully in this class we'll go through the book and try and understand to the best of we can some of the deeper ideas that he references to, and show the connection between using that, translating it practically into better living for ourselves. So if you open a book, you'll see on the first page, Perek Rishon. It's actually page Zayin. The book starts in page Zayin. You see, it's a relatively short book, but it's chock full of knowledge, and therefore I don't know how quickly we'll go through it, even though it's quite short. And it was written in a way which was very typical of the Rishonim, although the author, the Ramak, was not a Rishon, but it was written in the style where only a very few words were used to express in a very concentrated way a lot of meaning. So the fact that it's short should not be deceptive. There's a lot of depth here. So Perek Rishon. Ha'adam roi sheyitmei lekono. It is befitting for a person to emulate his creator. It's interesting that he uses the word, it is befitting for a person to emulate the creator, because it's really not something that a person, it's befitting, it's right, as if, it would be a nice thing, but not necessary, because that's not true. There's an obligation. V'halachta b'drachav. We are required to emulate the ways of God. It's interesting. He should have, it would seem, say, ha'adam muchrach sheyidmei lekono, or mechuyav lidmei lekono. A person is required to emulate his creator. It's befitting, he says, for a person to emulate the creator. It could be that perhaps he puts it this way in order to indicate that we actually have a choice. Right? It's our free will decision. It's true that we are obligated to emulate God and His characteristics, but whether we do or not ultimately is our choice. And therefore, what he's saying is it would be a befitting and, and appropriate choice for us to emulate God. And he's going to show how and in what very elevated ways we can do that. But the option or the possibility of not doing that is also going to be explored here as well. And therefore, I think that's why he uses the choice here. It's befitting and not necessarily, he doesn't necessarily phrase it as one is obligated to, although it is true that we are obligated to emulate God. Ha'adam roi sheyidmei lekono. It is befitting and proper that a person emulate his creator. Va'az, if he does this, yeh basod hatzura ha'elyona. The person will fulfill the mystery of the Surah Helyona, I guess the form or image on high. Tselem udmus, referring to the image, the tselem and the dmus, the form. And what it's referring to is the fact that we were created, as you know in the Torah, B'Tselem Elokim. We were created in the image of God. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Clearly, it's not referring, at least only to our physical appearance, because God has no physicality. And therefore, we can't say that our physical being emulates or mirrors or parallels in any way some physical aspect of God, because there is no physical aspect to God. Kabbalah discusses how we were created specifically B'Tselem Elokim, and not B'Tselem Yud Kei Vav Kei. Tselem Elokim is one of the names of God, as opposed to Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is another name of God. The name of God, Yud, Hey, and Vav, and Hey, means one thing, and the name Elokim means something else. The name Yud Kei Vav Kei is referring to God's, or the closest description we could have of God's essence, although the Jewish notion, certainly the Kabbalistic view of things, is that we cannot describe God's essence in any way. God's essence is beyond comprehension. The way we can comprehend anything about God is extrapolating about God based on the way God interacts with existence. Yud Kei Vav Kei is the essential, unique name of God that describes as close as possible the origin of his characteristics, or its characteristics, which we perceive. And that is Creator. But it doesn't talk about God's essence at all. The book Nefesh HaChaim of Rav Chaim Volozhin spells this out explicitly, that the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, like any other names of God, are descriptions of God's attributes. Yud Kei Vav Kei being the most central and important name of God, the one that most closely brings us to a description of what we can extrapolate about its essence, but still, it's not its essence at all. And Yud Kei Vav Kei is the name that denotes God's being creator. And it's related to the actual letters of the name of God itself. The letters Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. Okay? Yud, the first letter, corresponds to a Kabbalistic principle referred to as Ein Sof. Ein Sof means no end. The absolute infinity of God, no beginning and no end. And that letter Yud, which hovers, as it were, above the baseline of all of the other letters, it's like a transcendental letter. It corresponds to the transcendental nature of God. And the 2 points of the Yud going up and down correspond to this nature of Ein Sof, there being no beginning and no end, but a continuum. Okay? That's the letter Yud Kei Vav Kei. So the upper point of the letter Yud is referred to as the apex of the Yud. The Kotzo Shel Yud, the point, the apex of the Yud, is pointing in the upward direction towards the inexplicable essence of God. It's that empty space above the Yud, which that point is pointing into. That's, right? That's Ein Sof. That apex is referring to that kind of that dimension of Ein Sof. But that letter Yud also has a lower point, through which the power of Ein Sof, the infinity of God, as it were, is kind of transferred and delineated and directed downward towards creation. That would be pointing to the next letter in this name, Hey. Okay? The letter Hey has boundaries, not like the letter Yud. There's a box with a space in the middle. That's the letter Hey. This letter Hey corresponds to creation. As it says in the verse, Ele toldos shamayim va'aretz b'yom hibaram. There's a letter Hey there that's mentioned in the Torah, which is different. It's smaller than the other letters B'hibaram. And the Gemara actually says B'hibaram should be read as Behei Baram. With the letter Hey, Hashem created everything in heaven and earth. So the letter Hey represents a creative letter, a letter, the power of creation, which brings about space by delineating and making the possibility for space to exist. Okay? That's the second letter of Hey in Hashem's name. And then below that Hey, you have the letter Vav. Right? A Vav in Hebrew is a connector. A Vav is like a hook or a connector. It represents a connection. So that in the name Yud in Hey and Vav in Hey, the Yud is the Ein Sof, the Hey is the potential for creation, the Vav is the drawing down of that potential for creation to become realized through a conduit or a channel of divine energy, which pours out into or upon the final Hey in Hashem's name, which is actually delineating the physical space of creation. So that these four letters, Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, actually correspond to what's referred to as four spiritual worlds. There's Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Atzilus is the highest of the four levels. That corresponds to the letter Yud in Hashem's name. Atzilus means the emanation of divine energy. It's not the essence of the divine, but it's the energy that radiates from the divine towards creation, which is represented in that letter Yud. That's the world of Atzilus. Okay? Atzilus then directs that divine energy into what's called the world of Bria, corresponding to that second letter Hey in Hashem's name. The letter of Bria, as the name suggests, means creation. As we said, Behi Baram, Behei Baram. With the letter Hey, he built them. But this Bria, or creation, is not talking about a physical creation. It's talking about a potential creation. It's translating divine energy from the realm of Ein Sof, Atzilus, down into the potential for creation. It's kind of like the architectural plan for creation. And in that respect, it's called Bria, because when you think about it, the actual creation, for example, of a building is less about building the physical building as it is drawing up the plans for the building. The greater act of creativity is not the actual execution of the plan, it's the thinking of the plan. That's the creative point. And therefore, this realm is called Bria, the world of creation, even though there's no physical creation taking place there, because in truth, it is the germination into space of the idea for creation. It's the creative thought of divine will. And therefore, that's why it's called Bria. As opposed to, for example, the execution of the architectural plan of a building, being in stone and cement and iron or wood or whatever materials you're using to build, you're not really creating when you do that. What are you doing? You're formulating. You are bringing together different pieces and assembling something, right? But that's not a creation. That's really just a reformation of materials into a different shape. What's creative is bringing something from nothing. So a plan to build, which did not exist beforehand, is actually the more creative stage. The later assembling of the materials is just a reformulation of pre-existing things. And that's why the second level is called the world of Bria, the world of creation, even though there's nothing physical at that point that was created. It was just the drawing into, or the bringing into being, the divine plan for creation. And therefore you have the Yud, Atzilus, passing divine influence down into Hey, the world of Bria. What happens then is the translation of that potential for creation, the world of Bria, yes, into action. That takes place through the connector, the Vav. The Vav is the connection between these two Heys, the upper Hey and the lower Hey, where the upper Hey is called the world of Bria because that's where the plan was created. The lower Hey, corresponding to the world of creation, is where the actual program was brought into place. The Vav corresponds to the world of Yetzirah. Yetzirah is the kind of coagulation, in our analogy, kind of the collecting of the raw materials for creation, right? That's going to connect the plan to the execution of that plan. That's the world of Yetzirah, corresponding to the letter Vav, where a Vav means a connector in Hebrew. And then the final Hey, that's called the world of Asiyah, the actual making, the bringing into being of the plan of creation. So you have here then Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, which are describing God's relationship with creation as creator. Okay? That's Yud, Ke, Vav, Ke. What we're being told here is that man, being part of that creation, is supposed to emulate the ways of God, but not as Yud, Ke, Vav, Ke, because that's uniquely describing God as creator, and we can't create. What can we do? We can formulate. We can take pre-created pieces and assemble them in many different ways in order, right, to fashion new things. But when we do that, we're not creating, we're really fashioning, or rearranging, or reformulating things that already exist. And therefore, we are to emulate God, not through Yud Ke Vav Ke, but actually B'Tselem Elokim. Yes? We were created B'Tselem Elokim. Not B'Tselem Yud Ke Vav Ke, B'Tselem Elokim. What is Elokim? The name Elokim, as opposed to describing God as creator, Elokim describes God as regulator, as ruler over the creation. Yud Ke Vav Ke is creator. Elokim is the ruler over creation. We were created B'Tselem Elokim, we were given and endowed with the unique ability to rule over creation in a way similar to the way in which God rules over creation. That's Elokim. And Elokim is actually based on the name El, which is power. El in Hebrew means power. For example, Lavan says to Yaakov, Yesh le'el yedi la'asos l'cha rav, Elokecha amar emesh. I have El liyodi, I have power in my hand to do good, to do bad, to harm you. But your God told me not to speak to you good or bad. But El means power. So Elokim is talking about how God is not a power, but He's the power of powers. There are those who want to say Judaism actually has its source in idolatry. One of the proofs that they bring is the fact that Elokim is in the plural. Yeah? Elokim is in the plural, somehow suggesting that we believed in some plurality of gods, which ultimately, God forbid, ultimately came to be refined into one. That's not true. The name Elokim is in the plural not because, God forbid, Judaism ever believed in a plurality of gods. Because what we're saying is, God, Yud Ke Vav Ke, He is Elokim, He is the ruler over all powers. If people saw nature as a force and came to worship it, or other things as forces and came to worship them, Judaism says no. There is an overriding power over anything else that you perceive as a force. Don't worship the sub-forces, worship, right, the God which is over all of those forces. That's Elokim. We were created, but Elokim, we were given the ability by God to rule over creation. And that's why mankind uniquely is able to do all of the different types of things that we're able to do, both physically and also spiritually. We'll go into more detail about how we can affect the world spiritually as we go along. But maybe you were thinking of something earlier.
What's the relationship between that last Hey in UK, Vavke, and Das? Like Das for an individual? Because you said that an individual, when someone brings an idea, for example, into reality, into something, it seems like that is coming from not nowhere, ultimately God, but it's not some tangible thing. I mean, so it seems one could say that's a light type of creation, but you said that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to go into more detail in regarding the spheros about Chokhmah, Bina, and Das and the relationship between the two. And, I suppose it is possible in the realm of the neshama that we do have the characteristics of Yud K Vav K. But what I meant to say was in the physical realm. In the physical realm, we can't create something from nothing. Yesh mi'ayin. That's something only Yud K Vav can do. In terms of our interaction with the physical realm, we're more like Elokim. We were given mastery and rulership over the physical world. But you're making a very good point, and I did not mean to say that in terms of our, let's say, creative, intellectual, or spiritual powers, we don't emulate Yud K Vav K, and the reason for that is because all of that comes from the neshama, and the neshama is chelik Elokah Mimah. It comes from under the Kisei HaKavod of Hashem, Yud K Vav K. And therefore, since we do have a degree of Yud K Vav K within us, which is our neshama, we are able to conceive of thoughts which are new, and we can create things through our thoughts. Yeah, and that's coming through the power of Yud K Vav K. But in terms of interacting with the physical world, right, we're created B'Tselem Elokim, and we were given rulership over the world. We can't create things, but we can formulate them. We can reformulate them for our purposes, either for good or for bad. Yeah, that's a very good point. So here then, it is befitting for a person to emulate his creator. Then he will be able to connect to this mystery of the Tzura Helyona, the image of God in which we were created. Tzelem udmus, in form and an image. She'ilu yedumei begufo velo peulois, because if it were that a person were similar to God in his body alone and not in his actions, and I'm explaining in just a minute what he means by being similar to God in our body. Hare hu machziv atzura, he's actually denigrating and disrespecting the tzura, meaning the likeness of God in which he was created. V'yomru alav, and people will say about such a person, tzura noah, he's got a nice form, umasim kiurim, but his deeds are actually quite ugly. What he's referring to here is as follows, is that even though I said the second part of the book deals with the 10 spheros, and the first part of the book is dealing more with the 13 attributes, it's still appropriate here to understand what he's referring to on a deeper level, because he's calling upon a knowledge of the spheros here, by saying that if we emulate God in our physical form alone and not on our actions, then that's actually denigrated and disrespecting God, which does imply that even our physical bodies in some way emulate God. And I said before that obviously physically we can't emulate or be similar to God because God has no form. Physically, we do not emulate God. Nevertheless, our physiques, even our physical physiques, do have within them powers of the divine. And these are the spheros. I'll go into more details of the spheros later on when we come to the second part of the book. But the point here is as follows, is that in Jewish mysticism there's what's called the 10 spheros. Are you familiar with them at all? Have you heard of the term? The spherot? You familiar with these terms? You familiar? Not at all?
I've heard about them.
Yeah. So just some background information. The idea of the spheros, what's addressed actually by Kabbalah regarding the spheros, is basically the following problem, which is that our concept of God as being infinite has to be such an absolute degree of infinity that there should absolutely be nothing else that exists in the presence of God. Meaning, think for a moment, mathematically speaking, infinity plus 10 equals infinity. Infinity plus 1,000 equals infinity. Infinity plus 1,000,000 equals infinity. Anything finite, yes, cannot exist independently in the presence of infinity. It implodes into the essence of that infinity, right? So that, given this model, conceptually speaking, when we think about God as being absolutely infinite, that would mean God, infinity, plus creation, finite, should equal infinity, or God. Nothing should exist in the presence of God. The intensity of God's absolute infinity should preclude or prevent the possibility of anything else other than God existing. So a person might pull his beard and say, well, wait a minute, God could do anything he wants, can he? So certainly God should be able to create creation despite the fact that God is absolutely infinite. So what's the big deal? Are you suggesting that there's something that God can't do? Yeah, and I think the answer is yes. This is kind of suggesting there are some things that God can't do. But the reason why God can't do it, as it were, is not because God is limited. On the contrary, the fact that God can't do it expresses God's greatness. The point is, God is so great that there really can be no scenario where something exists other than God. Can't God create that scenario? You would want to say, yes, of course he can. But in truth, that's not correct. God, quote unquote, can't, because the ability to do so actually limits God. It's like that proverbial question, can God create a stone that he can't lift? You familiar with that? You familiar with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can God create a stone that he can't lift? What's your answer?
Can you create a stone that he can't lift?
Yeah. What do you say?
No.
No, he can't create a stone that he can't lift. So you've just limited God. He can't create a stone that he can't lift. He can't do something.
No, I said he can't. No, I said no to he can't. So no one that can't.
Well, wait a minute. Let's do it again. Can God create a stone that he can't lift? What's the answer?
It's a trick question.
Why?
Yes or no, it doesn't matter. It's still limited.
It's what?
It's still limited because if he can't, then he can't.
Yeah.
Either he can't create it or he can't lift it.
Yeah. So people kind of, intuitively answer, no, God can't create a stone that he can't lift. You've just limited God. You've just said that God can't create a stone that he can't lift. But when you say God can't do that, you don't mean to be limiting God. Really what you're saying is, not that God can't create a stone that he can't lift, but rather, there can be no stone that he cannot lift. That's really what you're saying. Can God create a stone that he can't lift? No. You've limited God? No. It's a trick question, because when I say no, he can't create a stone that he can't lift, that's because it's predicated on the idea that God can't create a stone that he can't lift, not because God can't do anything he wants, but because there can be no stone that he couldn't lift. God could certainly not be so when you answer no to that question, you're not limiting God. On the contrary, you're expressing God's greatness, the unlimitedness of God. And the same thing here as well. Can God create? The answer should be no. God cannot create something other than itself. Because by definition, there can be nothing other than itself. And when you say that, are you limiting God? No. You're actually praising God. What you're saying is, God is so great, God's infinity is so absolute and so intense, that there can be nothing other than God. It's not that God can't create and therefore God is limited. God can't create because he's so great. There can be nothing other than God. And that's what Kabbalah is trying to address, this question, because it's a very strong question. And Kabbalah answers this by saying that it's true, that the true and pure essence and the intensity of God's absolute infinity would prevent anything from coming into existence, would prevent, as it were, God from being able to create, not because God is limited, but as an expression of his greatness. And what God did to create was not so much to proactively create something outside of itself, but rather to withdraw into itself, to limit, as it were, the degree of its infinity, so that something else could exist in that vacuum, in that place. That's the Jewish concept of creation. Not that God proactively did this on day 1, and this on day 2, and this on day 3, but rather God withdrew this to extend on day 1, and that to extend on day 2, and that to extend on day 3, so that creation could come into place consecutively, correlating to the degree of withdrawal of God.
Is there a concept of when creation took place that there was the Ein Sof or something?
Yes.
And how did that work?
Yes, and that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about God's kind of withdrawing or limiting or withholding the intensity of Ein Sof in order for there to become a vacated space of God's presence through which divine energy could be directed in order to create. And this is referred to by the term of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is the Kabbalistic term for this. Tzimtzum means to constrict or to withdraw or to limit. And the way this is understood is if you think about like just like a white background, as it were. If God were to peel, as it were, himself out of that place, there would be a vacated space of darkness. So you have, let's say, pure, pristine, undifferentiated energy of God, which God then withdraws or limits the intensity of, so that you have a resulting vacuum of lack of divine energy. And then God directs a limited channel of divine energy into that vacated place, yeah? And that refined and directed energy is what's used to create something other than God, or at least what appears to be something other than God in that space. Okay?
So energy is the Ein Sof.
Oh, so the energy is the Ein Sof. That's the undifferentiated, pristine divine energy that exists before the Tzimtzum. That's the Yud. Okay? The Hey is the withdrawing and the Tzimtzum of the Ein Sof, resulting in a vacated space. That's our second Hey. Okay? Creating the potential for creation, the potential space, the theater for creation. The Vav is the introduction into that space of limited divine energy. That's the Vav, that's the conduit, that's a line that goes from the outer area of Ein Sof into the Hey, yeah? And then draws upon that divine energy for the purpose of creating the details of creation within that vacated space. That's the final Hey.
What are the details called?
Creation. Physical finite creation. Planet Earth and all the celestial bodies to the vast expanses of the universe. Okay? So that's how it's understood. As this undifferentiated infinity of God before creation. That's the Yud. There is the withdrawal or the concentration, the withdrawal or the limiting of the intensity of that infinity to make a space. In Kabbalistic terms, that's referred to as the Halal Panui. The Halal Panui is the vacated space, the absence or the limited presence of the infinity of God in that place. Right? The next, the drawing of a line from Ein Sof into the Halal Panui. That line is called a Kav, corresponding to the letter Vav. Right? And then the resulting creation, which results from the energy going through that Kav.
What about the Kuf?
What's that?
How about the Kuf?
The in the Kabbalistic idea, it's referred to as the term Kav, which means line. But it corresponds to the letter Vav, which is also a line. And in a way, this is also, I don't know if I go into too much details right now, but it's also described in kind of sexual imagery as well, insofar as the male productive energy is described as coming from the mind, and it's described as flowing down through the central column of the body.
Spine, right?
Yeah, the spine. Very good. And it's emitted through the middle part of the body, right? Where it's ejaculated into a space, where that space then takes that energy, gestates it, and creates.
Which sphere
Detail.
is this? The soul, the sword.
That's right. It would connect to that would connect to the spheres of Yesod and Malchus. Yesod and Malchus. We haven't gotten there yet, but yeah, if you're going ahead, that's that's where it would go. So that you would actually have the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and then the Hey. The legs would be the Hey, where the Vav goes down into the middle of the bottom Hey, and that energy is ejaculated into a halal panui, a vacated space. That vacated space receives that productive energy, and then gestates it and creates all the detail of a newborn creation. Yeah, the fetus.
Where in the spectrum of the Sphira is Sod and Malchus? I mean,
Of the spheros,
yeah.
so that's 9 and 10. Yesod and Malchus. So where am I getting with all of this? That this concept of tzimtzum, or the withdrawing of the intensity of God's infinity, takes place gradually through filters, where the filters, as it were, gradually reduce the intensity of that energy so that it can actually be used for creation without, I guess, enveloping creation. To avoid the result of infinity plus x equals infinity. And here's another analogy. If you think about like a nuclear plant, which is emitting huge amounts of energy, if you were to connect a nightlight into that source of energy, right, the nightlight would just be seared out of existence because of its very connection to the source of energy. What you need to do is to reduce the intensity of the output of that value, stage by stage, until finally, when it gets to your home, you can actually plug in that outlet so that the connection to the energy on the one hand now enables it to give light, but without burning it out of existence. And that's what we're talking about here with creation. The intensity of the energy of God, which would otherwise sear anything that's created out of existence and cause it to become imploded back within God, has to be limited so that on the one hand, that energy can be used to create without nullifying creation. That's what Tzimtzum does. And it takes place through this system of spheros, where the divine energy is filtered through these spiritual type of reduction stations, until finally it's able to be used productively to create without nullifying that creation. And that's what the spheros are. And there are 10 of them, or 11, depending on how you go. There's a Keser, an all-encompassing one. We're not going to be able to go into much more detail about this, just to lay out the foundation for tomorrow. There's Keser, yeah? Within Keser you have what's called Chochmah, Bin, and Das. Chochmah, wisdom, Bin, understanding, Das, knowledge. Then you've got Chesed and Gvura and Tiferes. That's the next triad. Chesed is loving kindness. Gvura is strength. And Tiferes is balance or beauty or splendor. Then you've got Netzach and Hod. Netzach is kind of like success, yes, or
Winning,
success or winning, or also eternity. Let's say success. You've got Netzach and Hod, which is beauty. And then you've got Yesod and Malchus. Yesod is foundation, Malchus is kinship. Malchus is the last of the spheros. All of that series of spheros above are like filtering that divine energy, passing it down from one to the other between the whole system, right? Until it's finally kind of reduced and filtered to the point where it can be expressed into the world. That's Malchus. Malchus means kingship. It's the last final sphera through which divine energy is ejaculated, as it were, in order for the presence of God to be known in creation, right? Number one, through His creating creation, and number two, through His ruling over that creation. And that's the sphere of Malchus. This kind of system of the spheros, which we'll talk more about next time you meet, since it was used as the filter for creation, its presence is projected onto creation. So if you think, for example, of like a movie, in the old days you'd have movies with intense white bulbs that would send that light through the colored film, yeah, which is like a filter, and then project the image of the film onto the two-dimensional screen, giving you the impression that there's some reality taking place in front of your eyes. That's in a way what's happening here. Intense, divine energy is being projected through filters. That then projects onto the, screen of creation, giving us the impression that there's actually something taking place here other than God. Although in reality, if you turn back, you'll see that it all actually comes from that source of very intense white light. All you have is filters which kind of, limit your perception of that, giving you the impression that there's something in between. There's some spectrum of varying degrees of creation, when in truth that's really not the case. It's all God. But the intensity of God has been limited and filtered to an extent that it seems as if things that are actually coming from and extending from God are actually living and existing separately from God, although in fact they are God. But in any case, this final sphera, this is called Malchus, and what the author here is referring to is how these 10 spheros, which are the filters of creation, have their presence and are imprinted into all levels of creation. The pinnacle of creation being mankind, the pinnacle of mankind being the soul, so that we have the presence of these 10 spheros in the soul. The soul itself projects those spheros onto the body, so the body itself also has a projection of these 10 spheros. Okay? And it's in this way that the author here is referring to. We'll try and delineate it in more detail tomorrow. This is what the author is getting at when he says, She'ilu yidmeh begufo, if a person was similar to God only in his body, v'lo bepeulos, but not with his actions, then people will say he's got a beautiful form which mirrors the 10 spheros, but the deeds themselves are ugly. These 10 spheros are understood as being in the physical form, ultimately, in human physiology, as being as follows. Keser is the cranium. Chochma, Bina, and Das are the right, left hemisphere of the brain and the brainal stem. Chesed and Gvura are the right and left arm. Tiferes is the torso. Netzach and Hod are the right and left leg. Yesod and Malchus are the sexual organ and the crown of that organ. Okay?
So the Malchus are the same thing?
No, they're connected. Yesod and Malchus. The one is the organ, the other is the crown. The conduit through which that energy is directed, right, and the crown which releases it. And in this way, then, the human body itself actually was created, right, B'Tselem, meaning it was created in a way like everything else, really, which is patterned after not God, but the system that was put into place by God for God to express itself into what seems to be a physical creation. That's the universe, right, as separate from God. So what he's saying is if we have in our human physiology the potential for connecting to spirituality through these parts of our body and our neshama and these spheros and God, but we don't live up to that potential, rather we use that energy for harmful, impure, destructive things, then the result is a great defamation of God's name. Because people say the form in its potential emulates the Creator, meaning the pattern of creation, that's the 10 spheros. But the deeds, the way in which it interacts with the physical world that it was placed within, is ugly, it's harmful, it's impure. And therefore, this book, predicated on these ideas, is going to be about connecting to the attributes of the Creator so that we are guided properly in order to express this divinely implanted potential for goodness within us in the right way and not use the power that we were given to destroy rather than to serve as partners with God at least in the ruling over of creation. And that's what we'll see more about when we continue B'ezrat Hashem.